Imagine a man so wealthy that his generosity destroyed entire economies. A king whose single journey caused the price of gold to collapse across 3 continents for over a decade. A civilization that built world-class universities in the middle of the Sahara, while most of Europe couldn't read. This is not mythology. This is not an exaggeration. This is the documented history of the Mali Empire, a West African superpower that controlled more gold than any kingdom on earth and created a legacy so profound that its echoes still shape our world today. This is the story of how a small group of people in the heart of Africa built one of the richest, most sophisticated civilizations in human history, and how that empire rose from nothing, conquered the impossible, and ultimately fell to the very forces that made it great. In the 13th century, the world was changing rapidly. The Mongol Empire was sweeping across Asia, devastating everything in its path. The Crusades were tearing the Middle East apart. Europe was feudal, fragmented, and largely isolated. But in West Africa, something extraordinary was happening. Along the great bend of the Niger River, where the Sahara Desert meets the fertile savanna, a network of trade routes had existed for over 1,000 years. These routes connected the Mediterranean world to sub-Saharan Africa, moving goods, ideas, and people across one of the most hostile environments on the planet. And at the center of this network lay the key to unimaginable wealth, gold and salt. To understand Mali, you must first understand what came before it. For centuries, the Ghana Empire had dominated this region. Despite its name, this empire was located not in modern-day Ghana, but hundreds of miles to the northwest, in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali. The Ghana Empire was the gatekeeper of the trans-Saharan trade. Arab merchants and Berber traders from North Africa would arrive with salt, copper, dried fruits, and textiles. They would meet West African merchants who brought gold, ivory, cola nuts, and enslaved people. Ghana controlled the crossroads. It taxed every transaction. It regulated every caravan. And it became fabulously wealthy doing so. The Ghana Empire's capital, Kombi Saleh, was a city unlike anything most Europeans of that era could imagine. Arab chroniclers who visited described a metropolis divided into 2 sections, one for the Muslim merchants and traders, complete with mosques and stone houses, and another for the king and his court, filled with traditional round dwellings and sacred groves. The king of Ghana was said to own a nugget of gold so large that he could tether his horse to it. His court officials carried swords adorned with gold. Even the royal dogs wore collars of gold and silver, caper. But Ghana's power was built on control, not production. It didn't mine the gold. It simply taxed those who did. By the early 11th century, cracks were beginning to show. The Almoravid movement, a religious and military campaign from the Sahara, launched invasions that weakened Ghana's northern provinces. Droughts affected agricultural production. Succession disputes fractured the unity of the empire. And perhaps most critically, the people who actually controlled the goldfields, the Mandinka and Soninke peoples, began to realize they didn't need a middleman. Why pay tribute to a distant king when you could control the trade yourself? By the early 13th century, the Ghana Empire was collapsing and the region was fragmenting into dozens of competing chiefdoms and kingdoms. Into this chaos stepped a figure who would change African history forever. His name was Sundiata Keita, and his story reads like an epic poem because it literally is one. For centuries, West African griots, the oral historians and storytellers of the Mandinka people, have recited the epic of Sundiata, passing down the story of the founder of Mali from generation to generation to generation. According to these traditions, Sundiata was born around 2117 in the small kingdom of Kangaba. He was a prince, the son of a local king, but he was born with a disability that left him unable to walk. In a warrior culture where physical strength was everything, Sundiata was mocked, dismissed, and underestimated. His father's other wives ridiculed him. His half-brothers were groomed for power while he was ignored. But his mother believed in him. She told him prophecies that he would one day become a great king. And according to the epic, one day Sundiata shocked everyone. He grabbed an iron rod, pulled himself to his feet, and not only stood but bent the iron bar with his grip. From that moment, he was no longer the crippled prince. He was the Lion Prince, a name that would echo through history, but standing was only the beginning. The real test came when a powerful sorcerer king named Sumanguru Kante conquered the Mandinka homeland. Sumanguru was brutal. He killed Sundiata's father and 11 of his brothers. He ruled through fear and claimed to possess magical powers that made him invincible in battle. Sundiata, now a young man, had been living in exile. When news reached him of his people's suffering, he began gathering allies. He traveled from kingdom to kingdom, forging alliances with other Mandinka clans and neighboring peoples. He promised them freedom from Sumanguru's tyranny. He promised them justice. And he promised them wealth. By 1035, Sundiata had assembled a coalition army. The climactic confrontation came at the Battle of Kirina, one of the most important battles in African history. The details are shrouded in legend, but the outcome is historical fact. Sundiata's forces defeated Sumanguru. Some accounts say Sumanguru was killed in battle. Others say he fled and was never seen again. But what matters is that Sundiata had won. In the aftermath of that victory, Sundiata did something revolutionary. He could have simply declared himself king and ruled as a tyrant. Instead, he gathered representatives from all the clans and kingdoms that had supported him and established the Kurukan Fuga, sometimes called the Mandan Charter. This was a constitution, a set of laws and principles that would govern the new empire. It established social categories and responsibilities. It protected certain groups from enslavement. It granted rights to women and children. It set rules for inheritance and property. And it created a system of councils and representation that gave voice to different clans and regions. The Kurukan Fuga is considered by many historians to be one of the oldest constitutions in human history, predating the Magna Carta's influence on constitutional governance. Sundiata was not just building an empire. He was building a system, and that system worked. Under Sundiata's rule, the Mali Empire expanded rapidly. He conquered the remnants of the Ghana Empire's territories. He secured control of the Bambuk goldfields, one of the richest sources of gold in the medieval world. He established military garrisons along the Niger River. He encouraged agriculture and trade. He welcomed Muslim merchants and scholars, understanding that commerce and knowledge were as valuable as military might. By the time of his death, around 1255, Sundiata had transformed a collection of feuding chiefdoms into a centralized empire that stretched across hundreds of thousands of square miles. But the true golden age of Mali came in the 14th century, under a ruler whose name has become synonymous with wealth itself, Mansa Musa. Musa came to power around 1312, possibly after his predecessor disappeared on a naval expedition attempting to explore the Atlantic Ocean. That story itself is fascinating. Mansa Abubakari II, Musa's predecessor, was obsessed with discovering what lay beyond the Western Ocean. He sent an expedition of ships. When only one returned with tales of a powerful current that swallowed the fleet, Abubakari reportedly outfitted an even larger expedition and led it himself. He was never seen again. Whether this expedition reached the Americas, as some have speculated, remains unproven. But it left the throne to Mansa Musa, and Musa would make the Mali Empire famous across the entire known world. Mansa Musa's reign represented the absolute peak of Mali's power. He expanded the empire's borders to their greatest extent. To the west, Mali's influence reached the Atlantic coast. To the east, it extended past the great cities of Gao and Timbuktu. To the north, it touched the Saharan salt mines of Tagaza. To the south, it reached into the gold-producing forests. Musa controlled an estimated half of the old world's gold supply. That bears repeating. One man controlled approximately half of all the gold available to Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. His wealth was beyond calculation, beyond comprehension. Modern economists have attempted to estimate his net worth, with figures ranging from $400 billion to $600 billion in today's currency, making him possibly the richest person in human history. But Mansa Musa's fame doesn't come from estimates. It comes from what he did in 124. That year, Musa decided to fulfill one of the 5 pillars of Islam, the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. Every able-bodied Muslim who can afford it is expected to make this journey at least once. But Musa didn't travel like a pilgrim. He traveled like an emperor. His caravan included approximately 60,000 people. There were soldiers, merchants, officials, slaves, and entertainers. There were 12,000 personal servants, each dressed in fine silk and carrying a staff of gold. There were 80 to 100 camels, each carrying between 50 and 300 pounds of gold dust. Musa brought thousands of pounds of gold with him, and he spent it freely. The caravan traveled through the Sahara, a journey of unimaginable difficulty. They crossed hundreds of miles of scorching desert, managing logistics that would challenge modern militaries. When they reached Cairo, the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate and one of the great cities of the medieval world, Musa's arrival caused a sensation. The Mamluk Sultan, al-Nasir Muhammad, was himself one of the most powerful rulers in the Islamic world. But even he was awestruck. Musa distributed gold to everyone he met. He gave lavish gifts to officials. He donated to mosques and madrasas. He bought souvenirs and supplies. He paid his soldiers and servants generously. And he did this with such enthusiasm that he fundamentally disrupted the Egyptian economy. The sudden influx of gold caused massive inflation. The value of gold in Egypt plummeted and wouldn't recover for over a decade. Chroniclers in Cairo documented this unprecedented economic event. The historian al-Umari, writing a few years later, interviewed people who had witnessed Musa's visit. They described a man of dignified bearing, pious and generous, but also shrewd. Musa conducted diplomatic meetings with the Mamluk court. He exchanged gifts and knowledge. He hired architects and scholars to return with him to Mali. And when he realized he had actually caused economic damage with his spending, he did something extraordinary on his return journey. He borrowed gold at high interest rates to remove some of the excess supply from circulation, attempting to stabilize the market. Even in this, he demonstrated economic sophistication that belied the Western stereotype of medieval African kingdoms. Musa's pilgrimage made Mali famous throughout Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Mapmakers began including the Mali Empire on their charts. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of the most important medieval maps, depicts Mansa Musa seated on a throne in West Africa, holding a gold scepter and nugget, with an inscription describing him as the richest and noblest king in all the land. Merchants from Venice, Genoa, and other European trading cities took note. The Islamic world already knew of Mali, but now even Christian Europe recognized that there was a power in West Africa worth acknowledging. When Musa returned to Mali, he brought with him architects, scholars, and books. He commissioned the construction of mosques throughout his empire. The Jingwareba Mosque in Timbuktu, designed by the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, still stands today over 600 years later. Musa invested in education. He expanded the scholarly community in Timbuktu, which would grow into one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world. The Sankor Mosque in Timbuktu functioned as a university, with scholars teaching subjects ranging from Islamic law and theology to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature. At its height, Timbuktu housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, more than many European cities of the same period. Timbuktu became a magnet for scholars from across the Islamic world. Students came from Egypt, Morocco, and the Middle East to study with West African teachers. The city's libraries preserved and produced works on philosophy, history, and science. This was not some provincial outpost. This was a cosmopolitan intellectual hub where ideas were debated, books were copied and traded, and knowledge was valued as highly as gold. The stereotype of pre-colonial Africa as primitive or backwards crumbles completely when confronted with the historical reality of Timbuktu. This was a place where literacy was common among the educated classes, where complex legal and theological debates took place, where scientific observations were recorded and shared. Mali's success rested on several foundations. First was its control of gold. The empire's territory included the Bambouk, Bur, and later Akan goldfields, regions that produced enormous quantities of gold. This gold was mined by skilled workers and carefully regulated by the state. The emperor claimed all nuggets above a certain size, while smaller gold dust could be traded freely. This system ensured that the royal treasury remained wealthy, while still allowing commerce to flourish. Second was salt. In the desert, salt is life. It preserves food. It's essential for human health. And the Sahara contains some of the world's richest salt deposits. Mali controlled the southern end of the trade routes that brought salt from mines like Tagaza, where enslaved laborers worked in brutal conditions, extracting massive salt blocks. These blocks were loaded onto camels and transported south, where they were worth their weight in gold, sometimes literally. Third was agriculture. The Niger River and its tributaries provided fertile land for farming. Rice, millet, sorghum, and other crops fed the empire's population. The Niger's seasonal flooding created natural irrigation, similar to the Nile in Egypt. This agricultural surplus supported cities, armies, and trade networks. Fourth was military power. Mali maintained a large standing army. Estimates suggest at least 100,000 men under arms, possibly more. This force included cavalry, infantry, and archers. The cavalry in particular were formidable. Mounted warriors protected trade routes, enforced the emperor's will, and expanded the empire's borders. And fifth was governance. The system Sundiata established with its councils, appointed governors, and codified laws provided stability. Provincial rulers had autonomy but owed tribute and loyalty to the Mansa, the emperor. This balance between central authority and local control allowed the empire to function across vast distances. But empires, no matter how powerful, contain the seeds of their own decline. And Mali was no exception. The very size that made Mali impressive also made it vulnerable. Communication across such vast territory was slow. Orders from the capital could take weeks or months to reach distant provinces. This created opportunities for ambitious governors to act independently. Loyalty to the Mansa was strong during the reigns of powerful emperors like Sundiata and Mansa Musa. But as time passed and weaker rulers took the throne, that loyalty began to fray. After Mansa Musa's death around 1337, the empire continued under his son, Mansa Magan. But Magan lacked his father's political skill and charisma. His reign was short and unremarkable. Subsequent rulers faced increasing challenges. And the empire had grown so large that it was difficult to defend all its borders simultaneously. To the north, Berber and Tuareg tribes, tough desert warriors, began raiding trade caravans and even challenging Mali's control of important cities. To the east, the Songhai people, who had long been vassals of Mali, began asserting their independence. The city of Jao, strategically located on the Niger River, was a Songhai stronghold. As Mali's grip weakened, the Songhai started building their own power base. To the south, the Mossi kingdoms launched raids into Mali's territory. The Mossi were fierce warriors who had resisted Mali's expansion and now saw opportunities to strike back. And to the west, coastal peoples and rival kingdoms sensed weakness and stopped paying tribute. Internal problems compounded external threats. Succession disputes became common. Without a clear rule of succession, powerful families and factions fought for control of the throne. These civil wars drained resources and divided loyalties. The army, once unified and formidable, split into competing factions supporting different claimants. Economic changes also played a role. The trans-Saharan trade routes began to shift. Portuguese explorers, probing down the West African coast in the 15th century, established direct sea trade with coastal kingdoms. This bypassed the Saharan routes entirely, reducing Mali's revenue from taxes and tariffs. Gold that once flowed north through Timbuktu now traveled west to the coast and was loaded onto European ships. Mali's monopoly on the gold trade was breaking down. The empire's wealth, the foundation of its power, was being undercut by new trade patterns beyond its control. Environmental factors may have contributed as well. Evidence suggests that the Sahel region experienced periods of drought during the 14th and 15th centuries. Reduced rainfall meant lower agricultural yields, which meant less food, smaller populations, and reduced tax revenue. Droughts also affected the Niger River's flow, potentially disrupting trade and transportation. While the exact impact is debated by historians, it's clear that environmental stress added to the empire's challenges. But the most decisive blow came from a resurgent Songhai Empire. In the mid-15th century, the Songhai were led by a brilliant and ruthless ruler named Sunni Ali Ber. Sunni Ali was a military genius and a pagan who had little patience for the Muslim scholars and merchants of cities like Timbuktu. He saw Mali's weakness and seized the opportunity. In 1468, Sunni Ali captured Timbuktu from the Tuareg, who had taken it from Mali decades earlier. This was a symbolic blow as much as a strategic one. Timbuktu, the jewel of Mali's empire, the city Mansa Musa had elevated to greatness, was now under Songhai control. Sunni Ali didn't stop there. He launched a campaign to conquer Jenne, another wealthy trading city. Jenne was protected by its location on an island in the Niger River's floodplain, making it nearly impregnable. Sunni Ali besieged the city for 7 years. 7 years. When Jenne finally fell in 1473, it marked another major loss for Mali. One by one, the empire's great cities and territories were being stripped away. The Songhai weren't just conquering. They were building their own empire on Mali's corpse, using the same trade networks, the same cities, the same sources of wealth that Mali had once controlled. By the late 15th century, the Mali Empire had contracted dramatically. It no longer controlled Timbuktu, Jenne, or Tagaza. The Tuareg controlled the northern territories. The Songhai dominated the east. The Mossi raided from the south, and various smaller kingdoms had broken away entirely. Mali's emperors still existed. They still held court in their capitals. But their authority extended over an increasingly small territory, primarily the original Mandinka homeland along the upper Niger. The great empire had become a regional kingdom, and then barely even that. The final decline continued through the 16th and 17th centuries. In 1591, a Moroccan army crossed the Sahara and defeated the Songhai Empire at the Battle of Tondibi, using gunpowder weapons against cavalry and traditional forces. This Moroccan invasion shattered Songhai, but it didn't restore Mali. Instead, it created chaos across the region. The Moroccans couldn't effectively govern such distant territories. Local rulers carved out their own domains. The trans-Saharan trade, already diminished, became even less secure. And Mali, reduced to a minor chiefdom, faded from international consciousness. The last Mansas of Mali ruled over territories that couldn't even be called kingdoms anymore. They maintained the title, the traditions, and the memory of what they had once been. But the power was gone. By the time European colonizers arrived in the 19th century, carving up Africa at the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, Mali existed only in memory and in the songs of the griots. The French colonial administration absorbed the territory into French Sudan, erasing centuries-old borders and political structures. The name Mali itself would not reappear on a map until 1960, when the modern Republic of Mali gained independence. So what do we make of this rise and fall? What does the story of Mali teach us? First, it obliterates the false narrative that Africa was primitive before European contact. The Mali Empire was sophisticated, wealthy, and powerful by any measure. Its cities rivaled anything in medieval Europe. Its intellectual traditions were rich and complex. Its economic systems were advanced. Its political organization was effective for centuries. The idea that Africa needed to be civilized by outsiders is revealed as the racist propaganda it always was when confronted with the historical reality of empires like Mali. Second, Mali reminds us that wealth alone doesn't guarantee survival. The empire was incredibly rich, perhaps the richest state on earth during its height. But that wealth couldn't prevent internal divisions. It couldn't stop succession disputes. It couldn't guarantee loyalty from distant provinces. It couldn't adapt quickly enough when trade patterns changed. Power requires more than resources. It requires effective governance, strong institutions, adaptability, and sometimes just luck. Third, Mali's story highlights the impermanence of even the greatest powers. In the 14th century, Mali was a superpower. Its name was known from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Its emperor was depicted on European maps. Its gold-fueled economies across continents. 2 centuries later, it had almost vanished. Empires rise and empires fall. That's the pattern of human history. No civilization, no matter how dominant, lasts forever. Not the Romans, not the Mongols, not the British, and not Mali. But fourth, and perhaps most important, Mali's legacy endures. The manuscripts of Timbuktu still exist. Thousands of them have been preserved, hidden, and protected through centuries of turmoil. They are being studied, digitized, and shared today, revealing the intellectual richness of medieval West Africa. The Epic of Sundiata is still recited, still taught, still celebrated as a foundation story for millions of people. The architectural achievements, the mosques and buildings constructed during Mali's Golden Age, still stand in Timbuktu, Djenné, and other cities, testament to the skill and vision of their builders. The very fact that we can tell this story, that we have sources both African and Arab documenting Mali's history, proves that this was a literate, documented, remembered civilization. And in recent decades, as African scholars and historians have worked to reclaim and tell their own histories, Mali has become a symbol of African achievement and pride. It's taught in schools across West Africa. It's referenced in art, music, and literature. It's a reminder that Africa's history is not just a story of colonization and struggle. It's also a story of empire, achievement, and glory. When Mansa Musa made his pilgrimage in Nuthen 2040, he wasn't just showing off. He was making a statement. He was telling the world that Mali existed, that it mattered, that it was a force to be reckoned with. He was demanding recognition and respect, and he got it. For centuries afterward, Mali was remembered. Even when the empire fell, the memory of its wealth and power persisted. European myths about Timbuktu as a city of gold drew explorers and adventurers for generations. Some of that mythology was exaggerated or distorted, but it was rooted in historical truth. There really was a golden kingdom in West Africa. There really was a city of learning in the desert. There really was an emperor whose wealth amazed the world. Today, when we look at the remains of the Mali Empire, we see both triumph and tragedy. Triumph in what was built, achieved, and created. A civilization that thrived in one of Earth's harshest environments. That turned gold dust into political power. That built cities where scholars gathered and ideas flourished. Tragedy in what was lost. The manuscripts burned or scattered, the buildings that crumbled, the trade networks that collapsed, the knowledge that disappeared, the political unity that fragmented into centuries of division and eventually colonial subjugation. But we also see continuity. The people who built Mali didn't disappear. Their descendants are still there. The Mandinka, Soninke, Fulani, and other peoples of West Africa carry forward cultural traditions, languages, and memories that stretch back to and beyond the Mali Empire. The griots still perform, the stories still circulate, and increasingly there's a recognition both within Africa and beyond that this history matters. That the Mali Empire wasn't a footnote or a curiosity. It was a major world civilization that shaped the course of human history. In the end, The story of Mali is a human story. It's about ambition and achievement, about building something extraordinary from almost nothing. It's about the corrupting nature of wealth and power, how success can breed complacency and division. It's about the fragility of even the mightiest institutions when faced with internal discord and external pressure. And it's about legacy, about what we leave behind and how we're remembered. The Mali Empire tamed the desert. It turned sand into gold and gold into power. It built universities where there should have been only emptiness. It created art, architecture, and literature that lasted centuries. And though the empire itself fell, though its borders were erased and its name was forgotten for generations, the truth remains. Mali existed. Mali mattered. And Mali endures, not as a political entity but as a memory, a symbol, and a reminder that the African story is longer, deeper, and richer than most of the world has been taught. That lesson alone makes the Mali Empire's legacy eternal.